Good day to everyone. We will be talking about the Age of Absolute Monarchy. But before we delve into the topic, let's define first what is Absolute Monarch. Absolute Monarch is a ruler who has a complete authority over the government and over the lives of the people. So in general, rulers like kings and queens is managing his or her own empire under their supervision. In this video, we will be talking about the Golden Age of Spain, the French monarchy, the struggles among the German states, and the developments in Eastern Europe with their honorable rulers who imposed absolute monarchy on their reign. So first, let's go ahead and talk about the Golden Age of Spain. It all started with the Habsburg Empire. The first Habsburg were Dukes of Austria. Through carefully arranged marriage, they gradually acquired an empire larger than any since the days of ancient Rome. A favorite Habsburg saying took note of their policy: "Let other wage war. You, O happy Austria, marry." So what happened is that Maximilian I was married to Mary of Burgundy, who acquired the Austria and Netherlands, and had a son named Philip the Handsome, who was then married to Joanna, daughter of Ferdinand II of Aragon and Isabella I of Castile, which the couple has ruled Spain and its empire, including Latin America. The Habsburg Empire reached its greatest size under Charles V, who ruled from 1516 to 1556, who was the son of Philip and Joanna of Castile, and was elected by the German princes as the Holy Roman Emperor. Early in his reign, the Protestant Reformation began in Germany. As a devout Catholic, he forced the German princes to respect the Pope's authority. But the princes in independent cities resisted his effort to restore religious unity. Eventually, Charles V accepted the Peace of Augsburg in 1555, which allowed German princes to determine the official religion within his territory. By 1556, Charles was an exhausted man. He gave up his throne and divided his empire between his brother and son, because he believed that the empire was too big for any one person to rule. He left Austria to his brother Ferdinand, who was then elected as a Holy Roman Emperor, and gave the Spanish Empire in the Americas, the Netherlands, Naples, Milan, to his son Philip. Now, let's go to the hard-working monarch, Philip II. Philip II ruled Spain from 1556 to 1598. During his reign, Spain was the most powerful nation in Europe. He governed as an absolute monarch. He trusted no one, so he watched over everything. He is also an intensely religious man, and Philip believed that his right to rule came from God. As a result, he governed with high sense of duty, and he worked hard to ensure justice. He also believed that his mission in life was to fight heretics and restore unity of the Catholic Church. So, he led a Catholic Reformation in Spain. He also sent Jesuit priests to convert Protestant all across Europe. In the end, his effort helped parts of Germany, Eastern Europe, and the Netherlands back under the Pope's authority. As a part of his crusade to revive the Christendom, Philip attacked Turkish strongholds in the Mediterranean. In 1571, at the Battle of Lepanto, his fleet defeated the Turks' navy. However, the Turks rebuilt their navy, and Philip was not able to drive them from the Mediterranean. Philip's effort to centralize royal power led to a long, bitter struggle with his subjects in the Netherlands. Many people in the Netherlands resented the fact that Philip put the interest of Spain above those of their land, and religious differences was added to the Dutch discontent. By mid-1500s, Calvinist preachers had won many converts among the Dutch. In 1565, when Philip ordered the officials to enforce laws against Protestant, the Dutch revolted. The struggle was bitter. Protestants went on a rampage, breaking glass windows and destroying statues of saints in the Catholic churches. Philip sent 20,000 Spanish troops to pacify the region. The Spanish commander boasted that in a 6-year period, his troop killed almost 18,000 people. The Spanish seized Dutch property and imposed harsh taxes that hurt trade. In 1581, the 7 northern provinces of the Netherlands, which were mostly Protestant, declared their independence from Spain. They were known as the Dutch Netherlands. The 10 southern provinces, with their largely Catholic population, remained in the Spanish Netherlands. The war dragged on into the 1600s, but Spain did not regain its loss in the north. The Dutch Netherlands emerged from the war with Spain as a leading commercial power. With more ships than any other, the Dutch dominated seaborne trade in Europe and overseas. During the Dutch Rebellion, the English watched Philip's activities with concern. Queen Elizabeth, a Protestant, feared that if Philip crushed the Dutch, he would then invade England. Therefore, she cautiously supported the Dutch and also allowed English captains known as sea dogs to wage an undeclared war with Spain. The English sea dogs attacked Spanish ports in the Americas and captured Spanish ships. The most famous sea dog is Sir Francis Drake, who made several voyages to the West Indies to seize the Spanish treasure. Philip wanted to let Queen Elizabeth punish Drake, but instead of doing that, she made him a knight, which infuriated the Spanish king. In 1588, Philip finally moved against the English. He assembled an armada of 68 vessels to carry an army of 60,000 soldiers to invade England. As the mighty armada sailed up to the English Channel, they engaged with the English fleet in a great naval battle. The smaller and quicker English ships quickly mauled the heavy Spanish ships and forced them to set sail on the North Sea. Violent storms in the North Sea destroyed many Spanish ships, which the English later called it the Protestant winds. Even though Spain was defeated, it did not seriously weaken Spain's power. Under the Philip II's ruling, Spanish culture blossomed. His reign was part of what is called the Century of Gold. What does it mean? Century of Gold is a period of flourishing in arts and literature in Spain. Even though Spain during this time is booming with arts and literature, they've experienced a troubled economy, which was one of the reasons why their power declined. The Spanish government depended almost entirely on gold and silver from the Americas. However, due to wars encountered, Spanish rulers soon drained their treasury to pay for the wars and had to borrow money from German and Italian bankers. Thus, Spanish treasure fell into the hands of arms supplier and foreign bankers. This increased the number of gold and silver coins in circulation and contributed to inflation. As the money supply increased, people tend to charge more of their goods and services, and inflation hurts Spanish industries because higher prices meant that it is to cost more to produce goods in Spain than elsewhere. By 1660, weak rulers were unable to impose unity as Philip II had done. Although the Habsburg in Austria continued to play a leading role in European affairs, but the Spanish Habsburg no longer dominated events on the continent. And now, let's visit France. Catherine de' Medici was Queen Mother of France, and was also tagged as the wicked Italian queen. Ruthless in her tactics, she played off the Catholics against the Huguenots, the French Protestants. In August 1572, thousands of Huguenots filled Paris to celebrate the marriage of her daughter Margaret and Henry, a Huguenot. In August 24, 1572, 10,000 Huguenots were slaughtered in Paris, and Huguenots blamed Catherine for what happened, and fought the civil war that followed. Wars of religion raged on and off in France between 1562 and 1598. The fighting between Protestant and Catholic nobles plunged France into chaos, and royal power melted away. In 1589, Henry of Navarre inherited the French throne and was named as Henry IV. He was a Huguenot, but he clearly saw that the only way to restore peace is to put the interests of France above those of religion, so he converted into Catholicism, because Paris, capital of France, was strongly Catholic. Afterwards, Henry issued the Edict of Nantes, which the edict gave Huguenots freedom to worship and the right to set up churches in certain places. In 1610, Henry IV was assassinated, and his 10-year-old son inherited the throne and ruled as Louis XIII. Early in his reign, the French nobles forced the king to call the Estates General to ask them to maintain the regency government until Louis XIII's 13th birthday, for him to be old enough to rule in his own name. But when the Estates General met, the nobles could not agree among themselves, and the assembly was dismissed in 1615. During this time, the French kings gained absolute power over the government. Louis XIII's advisor, Cardinal Richelieu, was chiefly responsible for increasing the power and prestige of the French monarchy. Richelieu wanted to prevent Huguenots from challenging royal power. He realized that he could not destroy the Huguenots without starting another civil war. Therefore, he allowed them religious freedom, but forced them to give up their right to fortify their towns, and also ordered the destruction of the fortified castles belonging to the provincial nobles, and outlawed dueling because feuding among nobles often led to civil war. When Louis XIII died in 1643, his son Louis XIV was a child of 4. As a result, his mother Anne of Austria and Cardinal Mazarin, Richelieu's successor, ruled in the boy's name. They continued the policy of centralizing power. When Cardinal Mazarin died in 1661, Louis XIV was 23 years old. The king immediately summoned his advisor and announced that he would rule in his own. For the next 54 years, Louis XIV ruled France with a skill and power unmatched by any other ruler in Europe. Louis XIV's motto was "Non his equal." His symbol was the sun, which suggested that just as the earth depended on the sun for its existence, so as the people of France depended on the Sun King. Under his ruling, the French army was reorganized. All French soldiers were to fight for the king, and for the first time, they were also given uniforms and was assigned ranks. He also directed government administration and appointed intendants or royal agents to rule the provinces. He is also determined to make France a unified Catholic country again. So in 1685, he cancelled the Edict of Nantes, and by doing this, many Huguenots fled to England, the Dutch Netherlands, and the Americas. And lastly, Louis XIV built a spectacular new palace at Versailles. The Palace of Versailles took more than 27 years to complete. It symbolizes the splendor and power of the Sun King. Louis XIV needed money to maintain the pomp and splendor of court life. The palace itself cost a fortune to build, and Louis XIV's program for government and the army were also expensive. During much of Louis's reign, Jean-Baptiste Colbert successfully managed the royal finances. He developed a two-part strategy for increasing royal revenues. First, he reformed the system of collecting taxes to reduce corruption among local tax collectors. And second, he introduced higher taxes. Under Colbert's direction, the French economy prospered. But Louis XIV spent too much of the money Colbert raised on foreign wars. because he dreamt of extending France to what he called its natural frontiers. The French ambition threatened nearly every other European power. For 30 years of Louis's 54-year reign, France was at war, at one at a time or another. The French fought the Dutch Netherlands, Sweden, England, Spain, and the Holy Roman Empire. The bitterest struggle was Louis XIV's last war, the War of the Spanish Succession. It began in 1701 when his grandson inherited Spain and all its possession. Other European powers then formed an alliance to prevent Louis from uniting France and Spain. The Allies got in the way, so at the Peace of Utrecht in 1713, Louis agreed that the French and Spain crowns would never be united. Louis' war left France deeply in debt, a problem that his successor would never solve. Louis lost his popularity in his last years, but Louis XIV had demonstrated what an absolute monarch could do.
Let's take a look on the struggles among the German states. One German prince gained more than most from the Peace of Westphalia. He was Frederick William, Elector of Brandenburg. His family, the Hohenzollerns, had ruled Brandenburg since 1400s. Hohenzollerns inherited Prussia in eastern Germany. Through the Peace of Westphalia, they acquired other scattered German lands. After the war, Frederick William the Great, Elector, established strong rule over his lands, and he built a strong army. However, an army cost money, and he tried to raise money through taxes. Noble landlords refused to grant him the right to impose taxes. Eventually, he won the right to collect taxes for the army, but the nobles themselves did not have to pay any. And with a strong army, the Hohenzollerns used every opportunity to expand their power. The Hohenzollerns established an absolute monarchy and transformed Prussia from a small kingdom into a major European power. King Frederick William I dedicated his life to strengthening the Prussian army. He doubled its size to 80,000 soldiers, recruited officers from the noble class. They trained peasants to serve as soldiers, and the army helped unify Prussia because soldiers and officers shared a loyalty to the king. Frederick also strengthened the Prussian economy because the Prussian population was small. He encouraged Protestants from France and other Catholic areas to settle in his lands. Frederick William I, son Frederick, seemed an unlikely successor because the boy loved to read books and play the flute. When Frederick became king, Frederick II in 1740, he proved to be an even more vigorous leader than his father, and he ruled Prussia with a firm hand and became known as Frederick the Great. Austria and Habsburg tried to establish tighter control over their empire and reduce the power of local nobles and make the Austrian Empire a Catholic stronghold. Charles VI had no son to inherit his throne since he feared that German princes and nobles might not recognize his daughter Maria Theresa as ruler of Austria. Therefore, he persuaded them to sign the Pragmatic Sanction. The Pragmatic Sanction guaranteed that the Habsburg lands would not be divided, and it recognized Maria Theresa's right to inherit the Austrian throne. When the emperor died, Frederick the Great of Prussia ignored the agreement and seized the Austrian province of Silesia. After Maria Theresa gave birth to her first son, she traveled to Hungary to seek help against Prussia. She promised to safeguard their traditional rights, and the Hungarian nobles responded by sending 100,000 troops to fight the Prussians. While Maria Theresa mustered her forces, the fighting quickly widened into a general European war known as the War of the Austrian Succession. The war in Europe grew into a worldwide conflict that pitted France against Britain. The French won victories in Europe, but the British attacked French possessions in Canada and West Indies. The the European nations signed a peace treaty at Aix-la-Chapelle. Only Frederick the Great benefited from the war because he was allowed to keep Silesia. Otherwise, the treaty provided that all territories should be returned to the nations that held them before the war. Austria and Prussia were among the major powers in Europe. They had strong central governments led by absolute monarchs, and they had well-trained standing armies. To them, the balance of power meant that no single nation was strong enough to dominate Europe. Suleiman has just become head of the Ottoman Empire. Ottoman Empire extended from Eastern Europe across Asia Minor into the Middle East and Egypt. They included peoples who practiced many different religions, and they were allowed to follow their own faiths. The Ottoman Empire reached its height under Suleiman, who ruled from 1520 to 1566. Suleiman had absolute control over the government and the army. After his death, the Ottoman Empire began a long, slow decline. Weak sultans ignored their duties and failed to control corrupt officials. Despite the decline, the empire survived until 1918 and continued to influence events in Eastern Europe. In 1613, the nobles elected a 17-year-old Michael Romanov as Tsar. Michael Romanov realized that being an elected monarch would limit his power. He and his heirs worked to end the practice of electing monarchs and tried to bring the nobles under their control. To win their support, the Romanov gave them an absolute control over their peasants and enacted strict laws to prevent peasants from running away. Russian serfs were treated like slaves since they were not only forced to give unpaid labor, but could also be bought and sold. Harsh treatments of serfs led to many peasants' uprisings, but such uprisings were quickly suppressed. Romanov expanded their territory eastward and discovered that Siberia had valuable iron, timber, and fur resources. Russia signed a treaty with China that recognized Russian claims to land north of Manchuria. Peter was a towering figure, almost 7 feet tall, and he had a sharp, inquiring mind. He spent much time talking to German and Dutch merchants who lived in Moscow. From then, he learned about developments in the rest of Europe. Peter set about westernizing his nation. He hired over 700 European engineers, shipbuilders, and mathematicians. He paid them high salaries to teach their skills to the Russians. He required nobles to serve either in the army or as government officials, and he sent sons of nobles abroad to study. Peter expanded Russia's borders since his main goal was to gain a warm water port that would allow Russia to trade directly with Western Europe all year round. The city named St. Petersburg was built by thousands of peasants laborers who were forced to work under terrible conditions. St. Petersburg stood as a monument to Peter the Great's power. Before his death in 1725, Peter had achieved his dreams of making Russia a more modern and more powerful nation. Catherine directed the Russian government with a firm hand. She had learned Russian and converted to the Eastern Orthodox faith when she married. She won the support of the Russian nobles by giving them a charter of their rights. It exempted them from taxes and excused them from the service to the state that Peter the Great had required. The peasants expected their own charter of rights from noble landlords. When it did not come, they rebelled. The peasants' rebellion was the largest in Russian history, but it failed. It led Catherine to take stiff measures against the peasants. During her reign, conditions for peasants grew worse, and more were forced into serfdom. Catherine earned the title the Great for her aggressive foreign policy, and she won a warm water port on the Black Sea by defeating the Ottoman Empire. In 1772, the first of three partitions of Poland took place. Catherine took part of eastern Poland, where many Russians and Ukrainians lived. Frederick eagerly took West Prussia, which finally united the scattered lands of Brandenburg and Prussia. Maria Theresa took Galicia, although she protested the idea of dividing the Poland. In 1795, Russia, Prussia, and Austria carried out the third and final partition. Poland ceased to exist as an independent nation until 1919.
And this has been the end of our topic for the Age of Absolute Monarchy for World History 2. This has been Kirby and Joanna, and see you in our next adventure.